The letter arrived on a Thursday, which Annalise Corfield would later think was a cruel kind of joke. Thursdays being the day her mother used to bake bread, the house smelling of warmth and yeast and something permanent. The letter smelled of nothing. It was written in a solicitor's hand, careful and bloodless, and it told her that Corfield Hall, the estate her grandfather had built, and her father had loved, and her mother had died inside of, now belonged to her Uncle Prentice. She read it twice. Then she set it on the kitchen table of the rented room she'd been living in for 4 months and went to stand at the window. Outside, London moved the way it always did, without concern for anyone in particular. She was 23 years old and she had nothing left. No money she could access, no family she could trust, no legal claim to the name she'd carried since birth, because Prentice Corfield had spent 2 years constructing a very careful story about her father's debts and her own supposed instability, and the solicitors had believed him, or at least found it easier to believe him than to investigate, which amounted to the same thing. What she had was this: the memory of every room in that house, where the floorboards creaked, which window latch was loose, the name of every servant who had worked there since she was a child, and which of them had liked her father, and which had merely tolerated him. She also had a letter of introduction from a woman named Mrs. Potterton, who ran a domestic placement agency on Carey Street, and asked very few questions in exchange for a modest fee. Annalise arrived at Corfield Hall on a morning in late October, when the moors were the color of old rust and the sky couldn't seem to decide between rain and simply threatening it. She came by carrier cart, not carriage, a deliberate choice. The woman she was pretending to be would not have arrived by private carriage. Her name, for the purposes of this arrangement, was Anne Fielding, lady's maid, previously employed by a family in Derbyshire who had relocated to the continent. References available upon request, and the references were real because Mrs. Potterton was thorough. She had cut her hair differently, dressed plainly, kept her posture slightly more inward than it naturally was, though this required conscious effort. Her mother had spent years correcting her shoulders. The housekeeper who met her at the back entrance was a woman named Mrs. Gable, somewhere in her 50s, with the particular kind of efficiency that comes from decades of running a large house almost entirely alone. She looked Annalise over in the way experienced housekeepers did, not unkindly but without sentiment. "Fielding," she said. "Yes, ma'am, you've done lady's maid work before." "3 years, ma'am." Mrs. Gable nodded once, as though this settled something. "The family is in residence until January. The master's unmarried. There are no laddies in the house requiring your specific services, but the previous girl left without notice and we're short-staffed. You'll assist in the household generally until we've sorted the arrangement." "That agreeable?" "Entirely," Annalise said. She followed Mrs. Gable through the kitchen passage, past the scullery, and into the servants' corridor that ran along the east wing. She knew this corridor. She had run through it as a child, sliding on the stone floors in stockinged feet while the cook shouted after her. She kept her eyes forward and her face composed. The master of the house, she learned over dinner in the servants' hall, was the Duke of Aldenmere, a title that had come to him not by birth in this county, but through a complicated inheritance involving a distant cousin and an estate that had been in legal dispute for nearly a decade. His name was Callum Davenport. He had been in residence at Corfield Hall for 6 months, which was roughly 5.5 months longer than anyone had expected. "He doesn't seem the type to settle," said the footman, whose name was Rupert. He said this with the particular tone of someone who had formed a strong opinion and was looking for confirmation. "He's not the type for much, far as I can tell," said the kitchen maid. Her name was Bess, and she had a frank, open face and opinions she delivered without ceremony. "Quiet, keeps to himself, doesn't entertain." "Is he unkind?" Annalise asked. She framed it as idle curiosity. Bess considered this. No, not unkind. Just not very present, if that makes sense. Like he's always thinking about something else. It made sense. What it told her was that she'd have less scrutiny than she'd feared, which was useful, and also that the Duke of Aldenmere was unlikely to be the kind of man who noticed small things. She filed this away. She was wrong about the second part. She saw him for the first time 2 days after her arrival. She was crossing the main hall with an armload of linens, unnecessary work, but Mrs. Gable believed in keeping people useful. When he came in from the east door with mud on his boots and a letter in his hand, and the particular distracted energy of someone who had been walking for a long time thinking hard about something, he stopped when he saw her, not in the way men sometimes stopped when they noticed a woman, in the way people stopped when something didn't fit. "You're new," he said. "Yes, Your Grace, Anne Fielding. I arrived Monday." He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he looked at the linens, then back at her. "We don't keep a lady's maid," he said. "There are no ladies. Mrs. Gable has me assisting generally, Your Grace, until the arrangement is sorted." "Right," he said, and went upstairs. She stood in the hall for a moment after he'd gone, her heart doing something annoying and involuntary, and told herself it was the anxiety of nearly being recognized. It wasn't recognition. She'd never met Callum Davenport before in her life. He hadn't known her father. He'd come to this estate through paperwork and legal inheritance, not through any history with her family. What unnerved her was something else, the sense that he'd looked at her and not quite accepted what he saw. Not with suspicion, exactly. More with the focused attention of someone who was accustomed to noticing when things were slightly off. She went back to work. What she needed was simple, in theory. The deed of Corfield Hall had been transferred to Prentice through a legal instrument that her father had supposedly signed 4 years before his death. A document that Annalise did not believe for a single moment her father had actually signed, because she knew his handwriting, and she knew his nature, and she knew that he would sooner have burned the house down than handed it to Prentice. What she needed was the original document, or, specifically, evidence that the document was forged. Her father's solicitor, a decent man named Mr. Harwich, who had since retired to Somerset, had told her this 18 months ago over tea in his cottage. He'd told her quietly, apologetically, the way people told you things they believed but couldn't prove. He'd told her that the signature on the transfer instrument didn't look right to him, but that his opinion was worth nothing without the original document to examine. And the original document was somewhere in Corfield Hall, because Prentice had insisted on keeping it there rather than lodging it with the county solicitor, which was irregular, and which Harwich found suspicious but couldn't act on. It was in the estate office. Almost certainly. She had 8 weeks before Prentice arrived for the winter quarter. He came every January to review the estate accounts. Mrs. Gable had mentioned this without prompting, in the ordinary way of housekeepers who kept track of such things. 8 weeks to find a document in a house she knew as well as her own hands. The problem was the estate office, which was locked. The second problem was that the key was kept on the Duke of Aldenmere's person, which she'd learned by asking Bess in a roundabout way, by asking about the general running of the estate finances, by seeming interested in the way country houses manage themselves. "His Grace keeps the office himself," Bess had said. "Doesn't use a steward, does all the account work on his own, which is peculiar for a duke, if you ask me, but nobody does." Annalise thought about this for several days. The duke did not entertain, but he did take his evening meal in the dining room rather than on a tray, which meant there was a dinner service to lay and clear, and on nights when Rupert was indisposed, which happened with some regularity, Rupert having a complicated relationship with the ale from the village. Annalise covered it. She learned things during these dinners, in the way you learned things about people when you were in a room with them, and they'd half forgotten you were there. And he read at table, which was considered poor form, but which he did anyway. He ate without particular attention to what was in front of him. He never sent food back, but whether this was satisfaction or indifference, she couldn't determine. He occasionally spoke to himself in a low voice, not words she could catch. More the sound of someone working through a problem. He kept a notebook in his coat pocket and took it out sometimes between courses to write something down. He also noticed things. She discovered this on the third dinner she covered. She'd moved a candelabra 6 inches to the left to balance the light better. A small adjustment, the kind of thing she'd seen done in this room for years, the way her father had always preferred it. And when the Duke came in, he stopped and looked at the table and then at her. "Why is it there?" he asked. "Better balance, Your Grace," she said. The shadow from the sideboard was uneven. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he sat down and opened his book. "You're right," he said. She went back to the kitchen with her heart doing its annoying thing again. She found the courage to ask about the estate records at the end of her third week, framing it as a question about account books she'd seen in the hall. Had the footman returned them to the estate office? She could take them if so. The Duke looked up from his notebook. They were in the library, where she'd been sent to dust, which was also irregular, but Mrs. Gable had her reasons. "The footman doesn't have access to the estate office," he said. "Of course," she said. "My mistake, Your Grace." He was quiet for a moment. Then, the directness of it caught her off guard. She'd been prepared for suspicion. She hadn't been prepared for perception. "I'm sorry? You asked a question that couldn't have the answer you said you were looking for," he said, without particular accusation. "The footman doesn't handle estate records. You've been here long enough to know that. So you were asking something else." She stood very still. "I was curious," she said carefully, "about how the estate finances work. I've worked in houses where the steward manages everything, and houses where the family manages themselves. I was curious which arrangement this is." "Why? Intellectual interest," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back because looking away seemed worse. "The estate office is locked," he said. "I keep the key. The accounts are managed by me directly, with quarterly review by a solicitor in York. That's the arrangement." He paused. "Does that satisfy your intellectual interest?" "Yes, Your Grace. Thank you." She left the library at a measured pace. In the corridor, she pressed her back against the wall and breathed. He knew something was wrong. Not what, but that she'd asked a question she shouldn't have asked, for a reason she hadn't given him. She had less time than she'd thought. The crisis came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. Prentice arrived 6 weeks early. She heard from Bess before she saw him. Bess, who had been in the village that morning and had seen Prentice Corfield's carriage coming up the northern road, which was unusual because Prentice always came from the south, from his other properties, and unusual because he wasn't expected until January. Bess reported this the way she reported everything, with frank directness and no awareness of what it meant. Annalise excused herself from the laundry and went upstairs to think. Prentice had not seen her in nearly 2 years, but he knew her face. He'd looked at her face across the table at her father's funeral and not offered condolences. He'd know her, possibly not immediately. The hair, the clothing, the context would slow him. But he would know her. She had 2 choices. She could leave immediately, which meant giving up entirely and never having another opportunity to get into that estate office, because Prentice would discover she'd been here and would move the document or destroy it or take steps she couldn't anticipate. Or she could find a reason to be unavailable to Prentice, to stay out of his sight, and get into that office before he reviewed the documents and noticed whether they'd been disturbed. Neither option involved telling the Duke of Aldenmere anything. She was reconsidering this when she heard a knock at her door. It was Mrs. Gable. "His Grace wants to speak with you," she said. "In the library, now." He was standing when she came in, which was unusual. People sitting down were comfortable. People standing were preparing for something. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. "I need you to tell me your actual name." She felt the floor do something unreliable under her feet. "My name is Anne Fielding," she said. "Your name is Annalise Corfield," he said. "Or it was, before the estate transferred. I didn't recognize you when you arrived because I've only seen you in one photograph, a family portrait in the study that Prentice Corfield had moved to storage. I had it brought back out last week because the arrangement of portraits in the study was unbalanced without it. I recognized you this morning. The room was very quiet." "Your Grace, Prentice Corfield is arriving tomorrow morning," he said. He moved up his schedule. "I received a letter yesterday." "I know," she said. "I heard. He'll recognize you." "Yes. Then you need to tell me why you're here before he arrives, and I have to decide what to do with the information that you've been in my household under a false name for nearly a month." She thought about lying. She was good at it. She'd been good at it her whole life, which was perhaps not a compliment, but was at least a skill. She thought about constructing something partial, something that protected the most important parts. Then she thought about his face when he'd looked at the candelabra, the way he'd said, "You're right." She told him the truth, all of it, her father's death, the transfer document that she didn't believe her father had signed, Harwich's opinion, which was worth nothing without the original, the estate office, what she needed and why she needed it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You came into my house," he said. "Yes, under a false name, to search my estate records, to search for a document that I believe was used to defraud me of my home," she said. "Your Grace." Another silence. He moved to the window, which was something she'd noticed he did when he was thinking, turned toward the outside, as though the solution might be visible somewhere out there on the moors. "The transfer document is in the estate office," he said. "I've seen it. I reviewed all the estate records when I took possession." Her heart stopped. "The signature," she said. "Did you?" "I'm not a handwriting expert," he said. He turned from the window. "But I studied it. It seemed inconsistent with the other signatures on your father's correspondence, which I also reviewed, because I review everything. I made a note of it." He paused. "I didn't know what to make of it at the time. I had no context." She stared at him. "You have context now," she said. "Yes," he said, "I do." Prentice arrived the following morning at 10:30, which gave them the night and the early hours. What Annalise had expected was a transaction, the Duke opening the estate office, producing the document, allowing her to examine it, perhaps engaging a solicitor. What she hadn't expected was that Callum Davenport would sit across from her at the library table until 2 in the morning, going through her father's correspondence alongside the transfer documents, his notebook open, his handwriting small and precise, building a case the way she'd imagined building it alone but couldn't have built half as effectively. He had the systematic mind of someone who'd managed complex things. He'd served in a land commission before his inheritance. She learned this in passing, mentioned by him without emphasis, and he understood documentation the way she understood it only theoretically. "The date here," he said, "near midnight, pointing to the transfer instrument. Your father was in London that week. Do you have evidence of that? He wrote to my aunt from London that week. I have the letter." "Where?" "At the lodgings I've been renting. Can you get it?" "Not before morning." He wrote something in his notebook. "There are 3 other inconsistencies. The date is the clearest, but inconsistencies multiply when you have enough of them. A solicitor who wants to press the case will find this useful." He looked up. "Do you have a solicitor?" Mr. Harwich has retired. I know Harwich. He was thorough. He named a firm in London unhurriedly, the way he named everything. They handle cases of this kind, they're not inexpensive. She looked at the table. I'm aware. He was quiet for a moment. I'll advance the cost, he said. She looked up. That's not. It's a straightforward advance, he said, against the eventual settlement, assuming the case succeeds. If it doesn't, we'll discuss it. I'm not giving you the money. I'm lending it with a specific purpose. You don't know me, she said. I know what you've done for the past month, he said. You arrived with a plan and executed it without causing harm to anyone in this household. You covered for Rupert twice. Mrs. Gable likes you, which is more difficult to earn than a duke's approval, I assure you. He paused. And I know that the document in that office is not right. I knew it before tonight. I should have acted on it sooner. It wasn't your responsibility, she said. This is my house, he said. What happens in it is my responsibility. She didn't have an answer for that. She looked at the document on the table, the careful, fraudulent signature, the date that was wrong, the life her father had actually intended for her sitting underneath the lies, like something waiting to be uncovered. Why? She said finally. He looked up from his notebook. Why are you doing this? She said. You could have sent me away. You could have told Prentice when he arrives. You had every right. I had every right, he agreed. But rights aren't the same as reasons. He turned back to the documents. My own inheritance was disputed. I spent 4 years in legal proceedings proving that the estate my cousin left me was legitimately transferred. 4 years of people telling me what I could and couldn't prove. He paused. I know what it is to have something that's yours and spend years explaining why it's yours. She looked at him across the table, the lamp between them, the documents spread out. His notebook covered in small, careful writing. I owe you an apology, she said, for coming in here the way I did. For the deception. You do, he said. I'll accept it. That's very gracious of you. I'm a duke, he said. We're expected to be gracious. She almost laughed. It surprised her, the way it surfaced unexpectedly, a real thing in the middle of everything. He glanced up, and something in his expression shifted slightly, though she couldn't have named what. They worked until 3 in the morning. Prentice arrived and spent 2 days in the house without once seeing Annalise, because Callum Davenport told Mrs. Gable simply that Anne Fielding had been sent to the village on an extended errand and would not be needed for a few days. Mrs. Gable asked no questions. This was the advantage of a competent housekeeper. On the 3rd day, Prentice reviewed the accounts with the Duke in the estate office. Annalise waited in her room with the door closed, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, listening to the house do its ordinary things around her. After 2 hours, she heard Prentice leave. She heard footsteps in the corridor and then a knock. He's gone, Callum said through the door. The solicitor in London received my correspondence this morning. They'll want to meet with you next week. She opened the door. He was standing in the corridor with his coat still on, and his notebook in his hand, and the particular look of someone who had been in a concentrated, difficult meeting and come out of it with information. Did he notice anything? She asked. He noticed that I had questions about several of the estate transactions from the past 2 years, Callum said. He didn't know how to answer them. I don't think he expected anyone to have looked that closely. A pause. He also asked about the portrait in the study. My family portrait. Yes, I told him I had it brought out because it suited the room. He accepted this. He wouldn't have had grounds to object even if he hadn't. She leaned against the doorframe. The corridor was dim and cold, and outside the window at the far end, the moors were gray and flat under an afternoon sky that had finally made up its mind and settled on rain. I don't know how to thank you, she said. You don't need to, he said. Not yet. The case hasn't been won. You know what I mean. He looked at her for a moment. That steady, focused look that she'd gotten accustomed to over the past weeks. The one that had seemed alarming at first, and now felt, if she was honest, something else entirely. "Yes," he said. "I know what you mean. The case took 11 months. The London firm was precise and tenacious and expensive, and Callum Davenport paid the costs without complaint and consulted regularly by correspondence. Annalise spent those months at a relative's house in Bath, assembling evidence, writing letters, waiting for hearings. She and Callum wrote to each other every week, because that was how the case required it, because there were always questions about the documents and the timeline and what she remembered. At some point, she couldn't have said exactly when. The letters stopped being entirely about the case. He told her about the land commission. She told him about her father, about what the house had actually been like before everything fell apart. He told her about the dispute over his own inheritance with a dryness that made her laugh in her cold room in Bath. She told him about Mrs. Potterton's placement agency and how she'd sat in that office, lying through her teeth, and feeling the particular terrible calm of someone who has nothing left to lose. That kind of calm is either the beginning of something or the end of it, he wrote back. It depends entirely on what you do while you have it. She had read this letter 3 times. The court found in her favor in September. The transfer document was ruled fraudulent. Prentice Corfield was given 90 days to vacate. She went back to Corfield Hall on a Tuesday alone in her own carriage, not a hired cart this time. She walked in through the front door, which she hadn't done in 2 years, and stood in the entrance hall and looked at the staircase and the portrait on the wall, and the particular quality of light that came through the east windows in the afternoon. The housekeeper who met her was Mrs. Gable, who had chosen to stay when Prentice left. Mrs. Gable looked at her for a long moment with that same assessing professional look from the first day, and then said, quite simply, "Welcome home, Miss Corfield." Annalise stood in her family's hall and did not cry, though it was a near thing. 2 days later, Callum Davenport called. He came in his own carriage and handed his coat to Rupert, who had apparently traveled with her from the other house, which Rupert had explained to Mrs. Gable as a personal decision he'd made without instruction. The Duke came into the sitting room where Annalise was reviewing accounts and sat down across from her and looked around at the room. "It suits you," he said. "It was always mine," she said. "Yes," he said, "it was." He was quiet for a moment, and she looked at him across the desk, the same way she'd looked at him across the library table 11 months ago, the lamp between them, all those documents, and something settled in her chest warm and permanent, the way the smell of bread on a Thursday was permanent. "You could have sent me away," she said, "not for the first time." "You said that before," he said. "You could have, though." "I could have," he agreed. "I didn't." He looked at her steadily. "I don't regret it." She believed him. The thing about Callum Davenport, she'd learned over 11 months and dozens of letters, was that he didn't say things he didn't mean. He was too precise for that. He noticed when the candelabra was moved 6 inches. He noticed when a signature was wrong. He noticed when a question meant something other than what it asked. He had noticed her. "Stay for dinner," she said. "It's Thursday." "I have no particular objection to Thursdays," he said. "We have bread," she said. "The cook bakes on Thursdays. My mother taught her." He looked at her for a moment, that focused, quiet look, and then nodded. "Then I'll stay," he said. Outside, the moors went on in every direction, gray and wide and entirely indifferent to anyone in particular. But inside the house that was hers again, the kitchen was warm, and the bread was rising, and Annalise Corfield sat in the room where her father had sat before her and found that after everything, the letter on a Thursday, the rented room, the borrowed name, the 11 months of waiting. The thing she'd been looking for had not been only the house. She'd known that for a while. She'd been waiting to be sure enough to say it. She thought she was sure enough now.